into life specifically. We've already talked about that all life is made up of atoms, ultimately, and those atoms are made up of subatomic particles. But it turns out there's very few elements of the periodic table that compose life. So life is mostly made up of just 4 types of elements. It's going to be carbon, because we're carbon-based life forms, right? So most of the life-dependent compounds in our body are carbon-based. So about 20% of the elements in our body are carbon. Oxygen is about 62%. Hydrogen is about 10%. And nitrogen is about 3%. So COHN, those are the bulk of everything that we're made of. Now there's some other ones, so about 95% or so is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and the rest are some other things. We got lots of phosphorus and sulfur, and then various other elements, a lot of which we get from our diet, things like iron, selenium, chromium, manganese, etc. So that's amazing, no matter what the diversity of life is, whether you are a human or a frog or a chimpanzee or a corn plant or a bacterial cell, we're all made up of the same few things. Out of 118 elements of the periodic table, 4 make up the bulk of life. That's really, really profound if you think about it. Now, you already learned about how these things react with each other. That, remember that outer shell? And if those elements aren't fulfilling the number of electrons in their outer shell, they're going to want to create bonds. So if they weren't able to create those bonds, reactions in our body couldn't occur, and life on Earth would have never gotten started. So let's specifically talk about organic compounds. These are life's compounds that all contain carbon. And so you can have big, huge compounds like this, but most of the compounds that are carbon-based in our body have some characteristics that are recognizable on these compounds. And these little recognizable aspects of them are called functional groups. So these are functional groups here. So functional groups. So for example, we've already talked about hydroxide ions. When they're attached to another compound, they're called a hydroxyl group. So let's take an example. Here's a compound, CH3, CH2OH. And you could draw that out. The C's would be connected to each other, and they'd have little H's coming off. But they'd also have coming off of them an OH, a hydroxyl group. So right away, looking at that compound, I can say, I can identify a functional group here. It's a hydroxyl group. A lot of compounds in our body, for example, all of the amino acids that make up all the proteins in our body, they all contain what's called an amino group, NH2. So this is an amino group. So here's a compound, CH3NH2. NH2. We know that's an amino group. So when we look at some of the amino acids, I'll point out the amino groups there. Here's a sulfhydryl group stuck on there. Here's a carbonyl group. So this is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. So here's an example compound. I'll big it up, carbon double bond, oxygen. That's a carbonyl group right there, and I could circle that functional group. Carboxyl group. So our amino acids all contain carboxyl groups. So here's C double bond OH. Here's one, C double bond to an OH. Okay, so I could circle that functional group there. Anyway, I'm not going to make you memorize all these functional groups. If you ever took a biochemistry class, you might have to, but in non-majors biology, you won't have to memorize them. But I want you to understand what a functional group is and kind of be able to recognize some of these, like, an amide, C double bond to an N, and then bonded to 2 other things. C double bond to an N and bonded to 2 other things. There's 2 CH3s here, so it would have 1 CH3 that way and 1 CH3 that way. This group I do want you to recognize here because this is an important one for life. A phosphate group, P double O, and then single bonded to 3 other O's. That is called a phosphate group, and that makes up the part of the sides of the ladder of our DNA. It makes up part of our energy currency for life, ATP, et cetera, et cetera. It's used all the time in our body. So you see phosphates a lot. So here's a compound, and right away, there's a P, there's a double bond O, that's a phosphate group, et cetera. So you get the idea. Functional groups are things that are attached to particular compounds, in this case, compounds of life, and you see those same particular functional groups used in all sorts of different compounds of life. So in other words, life doesn't like to reinvent the wheel. It kind of gets something that works and uses it again for something else. But taking all these compounds of life, we can all stick them together to 4 different categories of life. And these are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So these 4 compounds of life kind of make up everything we are. So our body is going to have carbohydrates in it, it's going to have lipids, it's going to have proteins, and it's going to have nucleic acids. And these are 4 things that we can't live without. So, if you want to go on a diet, you don't cut fat completely out of your diet because fats are lipids, and lipids are required for functioning of our body. For example, the outside of our cells is made of what's called a phospholipid bilayer. It's made out of fats. And so if you didn't have fats at all in your body, you wouldn't be able to make the outside of your cells. So we need all these 4 compounds of life. So let's first talk about carbs. Now, some of you, are familiar with the Atkins diet and things like that say, okay, get rid of carbs from your diet or reduce them down way, 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 way down. Not healthy. You do need carbs because ultimately carbs are what our cells eat. Specifically, this little carb here called glucose. And glucose is the fuel for your brain cells. It's the fuel for all your cells. And if you don't have it, you can't undergo what we call cellular respiration, which produces the energy needed to stay alive. So you got to have some carbs. And now if you cut carbs out, will you lose weight? Yes, you probably will. But you're also starving your cells of the fuel they need to do everything that they need to do. Now, carbs can come in different formats. We have simple ones called monosaccharides. So the term saccharides means sugar, mono means 1. So these are carbs that are 1 sugar molecule large. And these are also sometimes called simple sugars. So glucose has a chemical formula, and we'll be encountering this molecule quite a bit this semester, so you might as well learn it now. C6H12O6. C6H12O6. That means 6 atoms of carbon joined to 12 atoms of hydrogen and 6 atoms of oxygen. So here's a line diagram showing glucose. So there's your 6 carbons. They're all joined to each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they're bonded to an oxygen with a hydrogen attached to it. So that's a hydroxyl group there, right? So lots of hydroxyl groups here. Boop, 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 boop. There's a double bond O over there. Anyway, so that's the line diagram of glucose. Here's kind of more what it actually looks like. It's actually what we call a ring structure. So every corner here represents a carbon. So there's a carbon there, carbon there, carbon there, carbon there. Anyway, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, that's an oxygen right there. So 1, 2, and there's a 3, 4, 5, and then you have these other compounds over here. So this is the ring diagram for glucose. You don't need to memorize it, but I'm just showing you different representations of compounds. And this is really what the compound looks like in real life. Its atoms are spherical, and so they're all bonded together. Okay, so that would be a monosaccharide of glucose. Now, what happens when you take 2 monosaccharides and you join them together? You get something that looks like this. So you can almost see a monosaccharide on one side and a monosaccharide on the other. Well, you take 2 ones and put them together. Now you have 2. So now we have a disaccharide. Sometimes these are called oligosaccharides, but these are just 2 monosaccharides joined together. So some examples of this that you might find around the house. So here's the glucose that we just talked about. That's a monosaccharide. Here's another kind of monosaccharide called fructose. This is, so anything ending with OSE means sugar. So this is fructose, which is the sugar you get from fruits. So what makes your fruit juice sweet? This is fructose. And when you take a molecule of glucose, or compound of glucose, and add it to a compound of fructose, glucose plus fructose, monosaccharide plus monosaccharide, you get a disaccharide called sucrose. And so you can see they're joined here. Sucrose is better known as table sugar. So you probably had some of that in your coffee this morning. Okay, so those are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and if you get a bunch of these monosaccharides together, you get mini saccharides known as polysaccharides, also called polymers. So these are complex carbs. So you've heard of people talking about complex carbs in your diet. Complex carbs are polysaccharides. And what your body has to do to get the energy from those polysaccharides is they have to break those polysaccharides down. You got to break the bonds between these monosaccharides. So here's an example. So this is glucose, 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 and you can see they're all joined together. So to be able to use that sugar, to be able to get that sugar into your cells so that it can produce energy, it has to break the bonds between these different monosaccharides in the polysaccharide. And that takes a lot of energy. And so the more complex carbs you have in your diet, if they're things like starch, for example, starch is a very well-known complex carb, it takes a lot of energy to break that down. And so whatever it can't break down because it doesn't have enough energy, it's going to store as, you guessed it, fat. So too many complex carbs in your diet will make you fat. So starch is a polymer. Cellulose, which is the sugar that plants use to make their cell walls, for example. Chitin makes the shell of insects and crabs. Glycogen is a polysaccharide that's stored in your liver. So anyway, these are examples of these complex carbs, and this is what you call a ribbon diagram that sometimes chemists use on the computer to show how complicated a polysaccharide might look, for example. So anyway, the idea is that carbs can come in multiple forms: monosaccharides, disaccharides, also called oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides, where you have many monosaccharides joined together. So about those fats. So another name, or the more scientific name for fats, are lipids. And there are many different kinds of lipids with many different functions. One of their functions is long-term storage. So, if you have a little extra jiggle here and there, your body's actually stored that away for when you're starving so that you can ultimately break that fat down and derive energy from it. So it's kind of your body's way of securing yourself against starvation. And this is why, like, let's say you go on one of those kind of extreme diets, or that you pay a lot of money for. I won't mention names, but there are certain companies out there that will say, okay, come to our place, we'll feed you our food, and we'll drop your calories down to 1,000 calories a day. Oh yeah, you're going to lose weight. You'll lose a lot of weight really fast. And then as soon as you go off that diet, well, now your body said, uh-oh, you're not going to do that to me again. I'm not going to let you starve yourself like that. Whatever you eat now, I'm going to store that as fat. I'm going to get a nice fat reserve up there so that next time you starve me, I will be ready for it. And so you end up gaining back the weight with a vengeance, right? So, so lipids are for long-term storage. Now, the kind of lipids that are called fats, they're water insoluble, and that is because they are, partially at least, non-polar, which we'll talk about that in a second. And these guys are composed of this molecule. This is called a fatty acid, and it has up here a molecule of what's called glycerol, which is polar, and 3 tails. And these are called fatty acid chains. And these fatty acid chains are composed of carbons and hydrogens. So the black here represents carbons, and the blue represents hydrogens. And in this format, this is what you call called a saturated fat, because the carbons are saturated with hydrogens. That means everywhere where they could form a bond, if you think back to the Lewis dot structures we did before, everywhere where they can form a bond with hydrogen, they do. So this is a saturated fat. Have you heard that term before? This would be like the kind of fat you get from a steak, right? That is saturated fat, not very good for you in multiple or high quantities. Down here we see what's called an unsaturated fat. And the reason why it's unsaturated is because on the fatty acid chains, it has carbons that are not fully saturated with hydrogens because they have a double bond between them. And that double bonds are shorter than single bonds, so it causes them to kink up. So they have a kink in the chain, making this an unsaturated fatty acid. And unsaturated fats are a lot healthier for you in general than saturated fats. We also have lipids called phospholipids, and these are the lipids that form the cell membrane of your cells. And in fact, as we'll talk about next unit, when we talk about cells, the cell membrane is composed of 2 layers of these phospholipids. So we call it a phospholipid bilayer. So your cells all have this phospholipid bilayer, which means that your organs also contain this on the outside. So you have to have lipids in your diet to make sure that you can adequately create these phospholipid bilayers around your cells. And so this is one of the problems with things like anorexia, for example, where they actually are not getting enough lipids in their diet to protect their organs. Their cells have problems forming, and so it can be a lethal disease. Now, lipids can also serve as steroids, and steroids are hormones that are used for pretty much everything we do in our body. So certain genes get activated by certain hormones. Your personality can be affected by hormones. Whether you feel male or female can be affected by your hormones. So how many of you knew that cholesterol is a hormone? Crazy, huh? And in fact, cholesterol is the building blocks of other hormones called androgens. So specifically testosterone. And then the female hormone estrogen, all these have cholesterol as their backbone. I'll show you that a little bit later. Thirdly, we have proteins. Proteins are my favorite because they're the most diverse compound in our body. When in doubt, it's probably a protein. Proteins come in all shapes and sizes. They do all sorts of things. They have lots of different functions in our bodies. They play very diverse roles. So they can serve as enzymes. And enzymes themselves do multiple things. But enzymes are proteins, and one of the things they can do is act as what are called catalysts because they lower what's called the activation energy of the reactions in our body. So, in other words, in order to do certain reactions in our body that have to take place as part of our metabolism, if it weren't for enzymes, it could take 1 billion years to go from reactants to products. Well, humans don't live 1 billion years, right? So we don't have time to wait for that reaction. But thanks to certain enzymes, they can speed up that reaction. They can make those reactants go much faster to products. So instead of 1 billion years, it might take a fraction of a second. Much better, right? Proteins can serve as structural proteins. So things like a lot of the connective tissue in our body, like the collagen fibers inside our connective tissue, hair, nails, in other mammals, claws and fur. Our cartilage contains a lot of protein. Our bones contain a lot of protein. Feathers of a bird are made of the same stuff our hair is, keratin protein. The calluses you get on your skin have a lot of keratin protein in them. So proteins can serve structural functions and transport, like this guy right here. This is the protein hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is really what's responsible for making your blood red because it contains iron in it. And this is the blood transport molecule. This is what takes your oxygenated red blood cells and delivers them to your cells and takes the used up stuff, the carbon dioxide that is produced from those cells after they've done their thing, and takes it back out to your lungs. So hemoglobin is a very important transport protein, and there are many transport proteins in our body. Hemoglobin is the most obvious example. And we'll be talking about hemoglobin later on in the semester when we talk about evolutionary biology. We'll talk about sickle cell anemia and what happens with hemoglobin in that case. So, amazing. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different kinds of proteins. In our body, we have about 140,000 different proteins in our body. I mean, that's just amazing. But no matter how diverse those proteins are, they're all variations on a theme because they're all made up of the same building blocks. And those are called amino acids. And there are only 20 amino acids out there, other than some synthetic ones. And so all these diverse proteins are just combinations of these different 20 amino acids. And so I could show you all of life on Earth on one slide by showing you these 20 amino acids. And here they are. Again, if you took a higher biochemistry course, they might make you memorize these and their structures. But this is all 20 amino acids. Just different combinations of these compounds give you all the proteins on Earth. And you'll even see some similarities among these amino acids. Like, first of all, notice they're all composed of the same elements. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, right? And in a couple cases, you might have a sulfur in there. But for the most part, all just combinations of these 4 elements. It's kind of deep, isn't it? And so, valine, leucine, isoleucine, methionine, phenylalanine. Let's talk about phenylalanine. So how many of you have ever taken a yogurt that is one of those diet yogurts and it contains aspartame? Aspartame, not a good thing to put in your body. I could tell you all sorts of stories about that. I'll share some of those on the discussion board. But But some people are born with a genetic disorder called PKU. And if they have PKU, they don't have the enzyme to break down phenylalanine, which is a component of aspartame. And so if the food contains aspartame, not that anybody should be consuming that, but if you're a PKU patient, you actually cannot break that down, and that phenylalanine will start storing in your system, and if it's not controlled, it could lead to death. But phenylalanine is one of these 20 amino acids. Asparagine, that's the amino acid that is found in asparagus, and so if you've ever had asparagus and then a little while later, you relieve yourself in the bathroom from urine, and it smells pretty funky, think asparagine for that. Anyway, you can see that these come in different shapes and sizes, and look at some of the similarities within a group. Like here's valine, and here's leucine, and they're almost exactly the same compound, except leucine has an extra CH2 group in here. That's the only difference between them. Well, this could be the difference between having sickle cell anemia or being normal, because in somebody with sickle cell anemia, their hemoglobin molecules, which consist of 300 some amino acids, it's just one little genetic mutation leading to the difference between valine and leucine on that one amino acid out of 300 plus amino acids that results in sickle cell anemia. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And the only difference between those two things is one little CH2 group. I think that's very deep as well. But notice some of these functional groups that all of these guys have. Remember we talked about functional groups? So here's your little group here. This is your amino group. You might remember that. Here is your, when it's in its other form, this is a carboxyl group right there. So, so you'll recognize a lot of these guys here from other things. So that's all these amino acids, just different combinations of these give you your proteins. And the fourth group is a nucleic acid. So we have nucleic acids in our body, very important ones. So for example, our DNA is a nucleic acid. And there's others. Our energy currency, ATP, is a nucleic acid. Other things required for creating proteins, like RNA, are nucleic acids. So these are kind of the boss molecules. They control the structure and function of what goes on in a cell. And they're made up of little units. So each of these little things represented in blue here is what's called a nucleotide. And we'll be talking a whole lot about DNA this semester when we get into genetics. You'll go over the exact structure of DNA, how it works, how it's replicated, how it produces proteins. If you're taking the lab class, you actually extract your DNA. How cool is that? So this is your blueprint for life because it contains your genes, which are the instructions for making the proteins required to create all the traits of your body. So every 3 nucleotides pairs inside your DNA can code for a particular amino acid. And those amino acids together control for a protein. So we'll be talking a lot about that later on when we talk about protein synthesis. But all the fancy biotech stuff that we've been talking about, it's all what happens with this guy. It's all about nucleic acids and proteins.